and they made the laws to chain us well. And the clergy damned us with hand, or they damned us into hell. We will not worship the God they serve, the God of greed who feeds the rich while the poor ones starve.
Hello. Today we continue with the 2009 World Peace Forum. This time we present a paradoxical debate: to have a socialist revolution or to negotiate a gradual transformation. Miguel Figueroa, the leader of the Communist Party of Canada, on one hand, argues in defense of the United Front, an old tactic which unites friends and foes in order to defeat the biggest common enemy. On the other hand, Dan Labotz, a history professor from Oxford, Ohio, who considers united fronts or social democratic alliances with capitalist parties as the greatest tragedy for socialism. Let's hear both sides of the argument.
The topic this afternoon of the Popular Front, class or nation. I want to say that as I'm sure everyone in this room understands, the Popular Front was a tactic, a very significant tactic, but nonetheless a tactic of a larger strategy which was advanced primarily by the communists, by the communist movement internationally and individual communist parties, although it received the endorsement and in many cases even enthusiastic support of other trends within the working class movement, primarily amongst social democratic workers and leaders, but even beyond the working class movement, even in some bourgeois circles. It was, of course, put forward under different names and with distinct content at different times during this whole period, from the early 30s right up until the end of the Second World War. And of course it was formalized at the 7th Congress of the Communist International in 1935, and Georgy Dimitrov's famous report to that Congress. And while the emphasis of the United Front against fascism and war was on forging unity within the working class movement itself, even the tactic of the United Front included implicitly and explicitly certain cross-class alliances, clearly with farmers and the peasantry, but also with sections of the petty bourgeoisie and even with sections of the small and middle bourgeois class, particularly those who were opposed to the rise of fascism. Certainly by the time that the National Front was advanced in 1943, it included and even projected the leadership of that front by the big bourgeoisie and its parties, and in Canada, the Liberal Party of Canada and its Prime Minister Mackenzie King. In all of those countries where the Allied the countries of the Allied parties. And so looking at the tactic of the United Front or Popular Front from the perspective or through the lens of the nation, it appears that it was a choice between fidelity to the interests of the working class as opposed to the national interests. And it has been cast that way, that somehow the United Front tactic or the Popular Front tactic was, either intended or not, objectively a subordination of the interests of the working class to the interests of the capitalist class, the alien class. There's no doubt that the class-nation contradiction was one dimension of the tactic. But I would argue that it was not the only dimension, and it wasn't even the primary dimension, at least from the perspective of the communists who advanced it. Rather, it was the contradiction or the contradictory relationship between the national interests of the working class and the interests of the international working class. which was the decisive question. And in the end, the communist movement and communist parties determined, based on a corrected assessment of the nature and character of fascism and the grave danger it posed to the international working class movement, and to humanity as a whole for that matter, that the most decisive task was the overthrow of the fascist dictatorship in Germany and Italy. And even when the Communist Party advanced the slogan, "All out for the victory against fascism," and called for a yes vote in the conscription referendum, and even called for industrial peace and a no-strike pledge to maintain production for the war effort against fascism, the communists never saw this as subordinating or betraying the interests of the working class in favor of the Canadian bourgeoisie, but rather as subordinating the national interests of the working class to the international interests of the working class to defeat fascism around the world. Was the Soviet Union wrong in deciding to join the League of Nations and to press for coordinated action, even with other imperialist powers, to curb the spread of fascism? Or to rally international assistance in defense of the Spanish Republic? Or to seek a mutual defense pact in order to prevent the Munich sellout of Czechoslovakia to German fascism? Or for the Chinese party to enter into an alliance with the Kuomintang to oppose the German occupation of China and to drive Japanese imperialism out of China? Or for the Soviet Union, in fact, to join even with Britain and the United States and so on in the Grand Alliance to defeat fascism in Europe and Asia? And the answer is no, clearly. And the proof of the pudding is in the eating. Look what arose in the wake of the defeat of fascism in Europe, later in China and the victory of the Chinese Revolution, in Southeast Asia, in the movement for decolonization and so on and so forth. And what would the world have looked like if that tactic hadn't been pursued? And if fascism had been successful and victorious, what kind of world would we be facing then? Was it in the interest of the working class, internationally and within each country, in fact, to ensure that fascism was defeated? Yes, emphatically it was. And there are always hazards and pitfalls when one enters into alliances and coalitions. And it's much more secure to retreat into the pristine isolation, to become a sect, and to sit in judgment of others. But this is to replace, I would suggest, real revolutionary action with revolutionary phrase-mongering. And here I just want to end by quoting what Lenin had to say on this question. It's a paraphrase, but I think it's quite accurate from left-wing communism. To carry on a war to overthrow capitalism, a war which is 100 times more difficult, protracted, and complicated than the most stubborn of ordinary wars between states, and to refuse beforehand to maneuver, to refuse to temporize and compromise with possible, even though transitory, unstable, vacillating, and conditional allies, is that not ridiculous in the extreme? Well, I would suggest to ask the question is to answer it. And on that basis, I would argue that not only was it correct then, but we need to strive for that kind of unity today in the struggle against war, in the struggle against the consequences of the economic crisis, the global environmental crisis, and so on and so forth. So thank you very much.